Welcome to the Factal Forecast, a look at the week's biggest stories and what they mean from the editor's Factal. I'm Jimmy Lovaas. Today is June 4th, and in this week's forecast, we've got Ebola-related protests in Kenya, an oil workers' strike in Norway, elections in Armenia and Peru, and the opening game of the World Cup. You can also read about these stories and more in our weekly newsletter, which you'll find a link to in the show notes. Up first, we'll take a look at the protests in Kenya over an Ebola quarantine facility. For more on that, I've got Factal Senior Editor, Halima Mansoor. Hello, Halima.
Hey, Jimmy.
Welcome. But first I gotta say, seeing the words Ebola and protests in the same story is always jarring. So, what can you tell us about all this?
Well, a rare species of the Ebola virus has been driving a deadly outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was likely circulating and spreading for weeks or even months before it was officially declared in May. And there were many reasons behind this delayed detection, including collapsed health services after decades of conflict. But recent USAID funding cuts really gutted health surveillance there in the DRC. This Ebola virus in particular has no vaccines. And right now there are 3 under accelerated development, but none in the market. And there is also no known treatment. Though it should be noted that Ebola itself is not spread as easily as an airborne virus like COVID. Nonetheless, sometime in May, the Trump administration decided to break from the past practices of flying Americans home for care and instead go for a sort of medical rendition, sending them off to another country for care and treatment or observation, including Kenya. The plan is to build a 50-bed unit at a military base in Kenya, and obviously the Kenyans were not too pleased. And this has led to deadly riots and court cases.
And what about the latest? Have you seen any new developments?
Well, from all accounts, the U.S. has already sent doctors and staff and equipment into Kenya to prep the quarantine facility. This is despite a Kenyan court putting the brakes on the deal between the 2 countries before this weekend. The court order itself doesn't appear to have jurisdiction over the movement of U.S. troops or equipment. The order suspended the deal on the quarantine facility until the Kenyan government makes the nuts and the bolts of the deal public. Basically, Reuters today said they were quoting an official saying that everything and everyone is in there, everyone except the American patients.
Well, what sort of reactions have you seen to all this?
Kenya doesn't have any known cases of this particular Ebola strain at the moment, and Kenyans would like to keep it that way. There is this sense of betrayal that President Ruto's government sold them out for money without asking them what they thought about establishing a quarantine unit for foreigners only. There has been a lack of transparency around the whole process. This wasn't aided by the fact that a lot of Kenyans first heard about this plan from American media or social media and not their own government. The one that is actually getting some millions of dollars in health partnerships in exchange for the quarantine center. So all of this has led to large protests in Nanyuki in Kenya, where the base is. Protest organizers said 2 people died there at the protest outside the base on Monday after security forces apparently used both tear gas and rubber bullets against the protesters. Since then, doctors have threatened to go on strike if this plan goes ahead.
Well, considering all that, what do you think folks ought to be watching for next?
There's a few key questions that we need to see answered. So will the Kenyan courts allow this proposed quarantine center for U.S. citizens to go through if the Ruto administration makes the details of this arrangement public? And also, will the Ruto government actually physically prevent Americans exposed to the Ebola virus from entering the country? Because currently the court has suspended operations there. And even if the court eventually rules against the quarantine center, we don't know how the Ruto government is going to behave. Will it actually follow through with the court's orders? And either way, this might stir things in Kenya like we saw in 2024 with the finance bill, which saw weeks of deadly protests. So there's a lot to watch there.
Well, Halima, we'll pause there for now then, but thanks so much for your time and for keeping an eye on this particular story for us. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
A strike by more than 300 oil workers in Norway may begin on Friday. 3 unions representing the workers announced plans to strike if no agreement is reached with industry representatives. Workers are seeking higher pay and better working conditions. Officials have summoned both sides into mediation talks, and work stoppages have been banned until those talks conclude. Now, if the strike happens, 6 oil platforms could be affected. That would likely disrupt oil production in the oil-rich nation. The strike threat also comes as the world is going through an oil crisis due to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. It remains unclear whether the mediation talks in Oslo will result in an agreement, but a deal could prevent or delay any disruption. Armenia is set to hold parliamentary elections on Sunday. The vote will be the country's first legislative election since ethnic Armenians were expelled from the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region by Azerbaijan. The elections will determine Armenia's next government and whether Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and his Civil Contract Party remain in power. Pashinyan, who has sought closer ties with the West, is facing a number of pro-Russian opposition parties. Among them is former President Robert Kocharyan's Armenia Alliance, formed with the Armenian Revolutionary Federation and the Strong Armenia Party of Armenian-Russian billionaire Samvel Karapetyan. Now, the elections are widely seen as a referendum on Armenia's geopolitical future, following the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023 and ongoing peace talks with Azerbaijan. Armenia has also faced growing pressure from Russia as relations with Western countries have strengthened. Ahead of the election, Russia banned imports of produce from Armenia. If Pashinyan wins another term, that pressure could increase. Peru will hold a presidential runoff election on Sunday. The vote will determine the country's next president. Former Congresswoman Keiko Fujimori is facing former cabinet member Roberto Sanchez. The right-wing Fujimori has campaigned on promises to crack down on crime as Peru faces rising violence, extortion, and killings. Sanchez is leaning into his man-of-the-people image, appealing to a leftist base with strong desires for social protections. Both candidates face an uphill climb. Fujimori received only 17% of the vote in the first round, while Sanchez won 12% in a crowded field. Now, the election comes amid ongoing political instability in Peru. The country has had 9 presidents in the past 10 years. Both candidates also carry political baggage from the past. Fujimori's father, former President Alberto Fujimori, served prison time on corruption charges. Sanchez served in the cabinet of former President Pedro Castillo, whose presidency ended after an attempted self-coup. Questions have also been raised about the election process. The head of Peru's elections body stepped down a week after the first round amid uncertainty over vote counting. The 2026 FIFA World Cup will begin next Thursday, with Mexico facing South Africa in Mexico City. The tournament is being co-hosted by the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Matches will be played in 16 cities across the 3 countries. Mexico City will host the opening game, while the final will be played in July at MetLife Stadium, known during the tournament as New York-New Jersey Stadium. The expanded tournament will feature 48 teams and more than 100 matches. The first game will be played at Estadio Azteca, rebranded for the World Cup as Mexico City Stadium, in front of a crowd of more than 80,000 people. Now, Mexican officials plan to deploy nearly 100,000 security personnel during the tournament. That includes more than 20,000 military personnel and 55,000 police officers. The security operation will cover host cities and nearby tourist areas to help manage crowds and reduce the risk of violence. As the host nation, Mexico is expected to have strong support from local fans, while visiting teams are also expected to bring thousands of supporters. This opening game may not set the tone for the expanded tournament, but it will be seen as an early test of logistics, support, and security. As always, thank you for listening to the Factal Forecast. We publish our forward-looking podcast and newsletter each Thursday to help you get a jump start on the week ahead. please subscribe and review wherever you find your podcasts, and we'd love it if you'd consider telling a friend about us. Today's episode includes work from Factal editors Jess Fino, Avessa Maud, Dre Grant, and David Wiley. Our interview featured editor Halima Mansoor, and our podcast is produced and edited by me, Jimmy Lovaas. Our music comes courtesy of Andrew Gosby. Until next time, if you have any feedback, suggestions, or events we've missed, drop us a note by emailing hello@factal.com.